Hello and welcome to a Talmud Israeli production. Today we'll review the highlights of this week's course of Daf Yomi study, Masechet Beitzah, pages 5 through 11, Daf Hey through Daf Yud Aleph. Daf Hey. Tanya, Kerem Ravai Haylo Rabbi Eliezer b'Mizrach Lod, B'tzad Kvar Tavi. Rabbi Eliezer had some fourth-year grapes. Now, fourth-year grapes, Kerem Ravai, must be brought to Yerushalayim and consumed there. Alternatively, they can be redeemed, and the proceeds can be brought to Jerusalem to be consumed there. However, there was a rule that if you're within 1 day's travel of Yerushalayim, you were obligated to bring the produce itself, not the redemption money, to the holy city. The purpose was la'ater shukei Yerushalayim b'peirot, to beautify the city by having lots of produce there. In this instance, the case was Rabbi Eliezer, who had produce east of Lod, which was the westernmost boundary of the 1 day journey. So he was within striking distance, and he was supposed to bring his produce to Yerushalayim. However, he didn't want to. It was too much of a hassle. He wanted to declare his produce ownerless, that the poor could take it, because he didn't want to have the hassle of bringing it to Yerushalayim. However, his disciples told him, Rebbe, don't worry, you don't have to do it anymore. This is a rabbinical decree, not a Torah law, and it was a rabbinical decree that was formally abrogated after the destruction of the temple, that there was no longer any need to beautify the marketplaces of Yerushalayim. So he didn't have to make hefker, ownerless, his produce, since there was nothing to worry about. There was no longer any decree. Daf Vav. Amar Rav. Met b'yom tov rishon tatzukwa b'maminu. If a person dies on the first day of Yom Tov, that Jew can be buried, but the burial must be effectuated by non-Jews. However, if a person dies on the second day of Yom Tov in the diaspora, Yom Tov Sheni Shel Galuyot, then it's acceptable for Jews to carry out the burial. And even on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, it is acceptable for Jews to conduct the burial, meaning the second day of Rosh Hashanah has a status similar to that of the second day of the other Yomim Tovim, as opposed to the scenario with a Beitzah, with an egg, where the second day of Rosh Hashanah is considered different and special, not like the other second days of Yom Tov. With respect to the Beitzah, the egg is forbidden. With respect to a dead body, the corpse can be buried by Jews like on every other holiday. In fact, in America, this is almost never done. The Jewish cemeteries are closed on Yom Tov, both first and second days, and because of modern-day refrigeration, the burial can be delayed until the Yom Chol, the day after the holiday. Daf Zayin, page 7. When you do the shchita, the slaughter, on a bird or a chaya, a non-domesticated animal, there's an obligation of kisui hadam, covering the blood with dirt. However, it's not enough just to cover the top of the blood with dirt. It's necessary to have dirt underneath and above the blood. Lemata ulemala. Why? Because it says in the Torah, be'afar, v'chisau be'afar. Not just afar, but be'afar, in dirt, meaning dirt on top and bottom of the blood. Daf 8. Koi ein shochten oto b'yom tov, v'mshachato en machasin et damo. A person is not supposed to slaughter a koi on Yom Tov. Now, a koi is an animal whose status is uncertain. It's not clear whether this koi is a behema or a chaya. If it's a behema, then there's no obligation to cover the blood. If it's a chaya, there is an obligation to cover the blood. So because we don't want to be in a situation of doubt on Yom Tov, where we would feel a need to do an extra exertion of covering blood with dirt, so we'd rather not have this situation develop. You should therefore not slaughter a koi on Yom Tov. And if you did slaughter the koi, in contravening the official rules, then don't cover the blood, because it might not be necessary, and you can eat the meat anyway, even in the absence of blood being covered. Daf Tet 9. Gilgel Isam Erev Yom Tov. What happens if you prepared a dough from Erev Yom Tov? Are you allowed to separate challah from that dough on Yom Tov? So one opinion in the Gemara is that you cannot. Another opinion in the Gemara is that you can. You are allowed to separate the challah from the dough on Yom Tov. The halacha does not accord with this opinion, by the way. However, why does anyone say that you can separate challah on Yom Tov, when after all, separating of trumot and masrot in general are forbidden on Yom Tov? So Rashi explains, Lo gazru al trumat isa, they did not make a decree against separating the truma of an isa, of a dough, because you're allowed to prepare doughs fresh on Yom Tov to eat hot bread. So since it is necessary in some instances to enjoy the Yom Tov, to ideally have hot bread, and that will require the creation of a new dough and the separation of a challah on Yom Tov. That's why this Manda Amar, this opinion says that even if the dough was prepared ahead of Yom Tov, you could still separate the challah on Yom Tov. But halacha does not accord with that opinion. Daf Tet. Beit Shammai Omrim Inotin et Orlif Ne'adorsan Velo Yarbienu Elim Ken Yesh Lav Kazait Basar. Ubeitilam Matirim. So Beit Shammai says you're not allowed to take a hide of an animal, a freshly slaughtered animal, and place this hide of an animal in a spot on the floor where it's going to be trampled upon and effectively worked over by the pedestrians. That the process of preparing a hide, the tanning process, involves trampling upon the skin of the animal. So it's a malacha if done intentionally. What happens if done unintentionally? It's just placed on the floor and people are walking by. So Beit Shammai says you can't do this. And you can't lift it up off the ground unless it is still with a kazait of basar, olive's bulk of flesh on it, so that it's not muksa. But it's not just a hide, but rather it's a repository of meat, which could be used for eating on Yom Tov. However, Beit Hillel says, no, it's allowed. You're allowed to place the hide on the floor. You can pick up off the floor, even in the absence of a kazait basar remaining on the hide. Daf Yud Aleph. Molech adam kama chatichot basar b'vat. The person is allowed to salt many pieces of meat at one time on Yom Tov, even though for the consumption purposes on Yom Tov, you only need one piece of meat. Nonetheless, you're allowed to do the act of preparing, of preserving many pieces of meat. Why should this be okay? Granted, for Simchat Yom Tov, you're allowed to salt the meat you're going to eat that day. However, what about the meat you're not going to eat that day? Shouldn't this be considered forbidden on the grounds of tircha yetera, of extra effort, extra exertion, or preparing from a holiday to a mundane day? So Rashi explains why is this allowed? The chad tircha lekulhu, because if in one throw of the salt you can cover a whole bunch of pieces, then there was no extra effort exerted. It was simply the same effort you would have done had you just wanted to prepare the one piece of meat you're eating for the Yom Tov. Everyone have a great week. A Gemar Chatima Tova.